Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim, resident fellow with the Leadership Institute of Nevada, and I'm here today with one of my former professors, Dr. Jon Fullerton. He's on faculty with the Executive Leadership Academy here. He's also Executive Director of the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard University. John, it's great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
So, John, let's start with talking about school funding and school finance. Here in Nevada, there's been a lot of ongoing conversation looking at our state's funding formula for public schools, the Nevada Plan. There's been conversations about both increasing the base funding that's provided to public schools, but also looking at moving towards a weighted student funding formula. As you've looked around the country, you've done research, you've worked in school finance, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in terms of states revisiting their public education funding formulas?
So I think as times change and as needs change, many states are revisiting their funding formulas. For instance, Massachusetts is revisiting it even now.
Even with Chapter 70.
Even with Chapter 70. So they've had a pretty, I think, interesting approach to school funding, but they've recognized that sort of over time, some of the assumptions that they had built into the formula don't work anymore. So, for instance, they've noticed healthcare costs have grown at a much faster rate and take up much more of the budget than they had sort of planned on in the foundation budgets. Likewise, special education costs have been growing. So they're really rethinking about how do they kind of rebalance the funding. So I think revisiting finance formulas is generally a good idea, and thinking about both sort of like is sufficient money is going to schools and kids, but also thinking about where's that money coming from, and so are taxpayers being treated fairly, and are different communities able to support their schools regardless of the economic strength of the community.
And that's been part of this conversation here in Nevada. Under our current funding formula, the Nevada Plan, there are certain calculations relating to transportation costs. Say, for example, if you're in a rural school district with a lot of distance to travel, if the district has to cover more transportation, that goes into the formula. There's some information regarding demographics or the size of a school district, the student enrollment. But part of the conversation in terms of possibly changing the formula involves looking at moving towards weights. So, for example, having weights for students who are English learners, adding more weights for students who are in special education. What are some examples that perhaps Nevada could look to if we're thinking about moving towards a weighted student funding model? I think about Boston,
right?
For one thing, Boston Public Schools and what they're doing there.
Right. So I think there's a number of, like, you can look at districts. So there's two ways you can think of weighting. There's two places where weighted student models are used. One is within districts to distribute money that districts have to schools. And then the second, which is really what Nevada's talking about right now, is weights to distribute money to districts, or to at least determine how much sort of the appropriate spending is in a given district. And there again, actually, I think Massachusetts has a good example where they do weights on English learners. They also weight on children in poverty, and they don't really do weights on special education, but they do have a sort of a reimbursement mechanism that kicks in for very expensive services. So Massachusetts, I think, is an interesting place to look. Vermont has some interesting things going on as well, and yeah. So I think the weighted approach makes sense. It's sort of it is intuitive, and I think to some degree, obviously correct. The sort of students with different needs will have different costs, and so sort of having some understanding of that and building that into the system makes a lot of sense. The thing that's the thing that's actually more challenging is what should those weights be. So different places have come to different conclusions on that. But one of the nice things about weights is they make it very explicit what the assumption is. So if a weight of 0.3 for teaching an English learner suggests that sort of we think that English learners cost 1.3 times what sort of non-English learners cost. And
in terms of paying for the staff.
In terms of paying for staff and extra supports that are needed. And but then that's very explicit, and you can debate about sort of, is it that much? Is it too little? Is it too much? But sort of it's a transparent formula in terms of how much of what the state actually believes, and so that sort of opens that up for conversation. And it's easier to do it in a way that way than through what I believe Nevada does now, which is through categorical funds that sometimes there's a lot of crossing categoricals and you can't quite tell, well, what are students with different needs actually getting or not. So this sort of like it puts it all out in kind of a very easy way to understand.
Yeah, right now we have these categorical funding streams through Zoom and Victory funds and some others. But I see your point. If a system moves towards having weights, then it opens up space for public debate with the community and with policymakers over where's the money going. It brings to mind something that you bring up with your students, and that is if you're looking at finance, how a system determines its budget in many ways is a reflection of what that system values.
Right.
And I see that happening here in Nevada with this ongoing debate over school funding. On that note, as you're thinking about policymakers in different states looking at school funding formulas, are there 2 or 3 lessons, takeaways, things you think policymakers ought to keep in mind as they're looking at tweaking an education funding formula, whether making small changes or making an overall revision?
So I think maybe 3 things. So one is understanding sort of how have underlying cost structures changed over time. So the example there would be healthcare. So healthcare and insurance costs and potentially sort of pension costs have changed over time, and sort of understanding the impact of that on the amount of money left after paying for those things is quite important. So really so understanding kind of what are the cost drivers that are a little bit outside of control of potentially outside of the control of the state. I think second is really thinking through or trying to think through what are potential unintended consequences of changes, and that's a very broad thing to say, but sort of just almost think about what are the ways this could go wrong, or what are the possible responses people will have to this that sort of are not in the best interest of kids. And then the third thing is sort of a lot of these, and certainly I think the sort of things being considered in Nevada are really about sort of. Part of it is putting putting more money into the schooling system itself. And the state policymakers should think about how are they going to ensure that money is spent effectively, and ensure that sort of it's not just sort of pushing out more money, but sort of nothing's really going to change, if you will, in terms of outcomes or organization. One way that sort of at the center with Tom Kane, our faculty director, we've been thinking about is could states sort of establish essentially an innovation fund? So because one of the issues is like we know that sort of kids in poverty have higher needs than kids who are better off economically. But what the answer is, what we should be doing, is not so clear. That doesn't mean there's not things that work or are effective, but maybe sort of before we say, okay, you've got a new program you want to try, we're going to roll it out to all of Clark County. Let's actually sort of have maybe there's a state fund that sort of says, okay, well, give us your good ideas, and we'll give you back enough money to roll it out, not to all of Clark County, or not to, but only to sort of the number of schools and or classrooms and or students that are needed to figure out, does this thing work? Does it actually move the needle on achievement? And so first we'll test it at that level, and then after we see it is effective, we'll sort of provide sort of additional supports to roll it out, sort of countywide and or statewide, but basically sort of allow kind of a learning network, if you will, to allow to sort of acquire a little bit more testing, experimentation, and piloting before rolling things out to everyone.
And on that point, perhaps in some ways for schools that have received Victory or Zoom funds or some other funds from the state throughout the last several years, if they've been able to develop programs or methods or supports to better serve their students, perhaps in a way that served as a sort of innovation sort of space, right? And perhaps if the state moves towards a weighted student funding formula in the next several years or the next legislative session, there are some examples here in Clark County of what schools have been able to do with some of those extra, these categorical funds.
Right.
But one of the conversations going on as well is whether the state should look at establishing weights first and then looking at increasing the base afterwards, or whether the state should look at increasing the base first and then considering weights afterwards. Do you think it's a chicken or the egg problem, or is there a way to look at both at the same time?
I would think of looking at both at the same time, because they're both sort of, you want to sort of make sure you've got a sufficient, or you want to understand kind of where you are on the base, but then there are also different needs for different kids. And I don't see why you wouldn't. And one of the nice things actually about weighted student, sort of the weights approach, is that if you have weights and you have a base and you have maybe some target that you want to reach in terms of here's how much we'd like to spend on the base and here's what we think the weight should be. If you can't get there all at once, with both of them, you can basically sort of like prorate those down, sort of using the weights and using sort of a smaller base than maybe you sort of ultimately want to get to. So I think I would not think of it as separating them into stages, but actually think of it as like how can we fund equitably, by which we mean both equitably sort of horizontally across similar students and equitably vertically across sort of students with different needs. How can we best fund that now, and then where and then have a roadmap for where you're going.
Indeed, I like that, thinking about having a roadmap where we can go, but you got to start somewhere on that. Let's take a look as well at some of the other research and work that you and your colleagues at Harvard are doing through the Center for Education Policy Research. What are some other trends or big things that you see happening nationally in terms of education policy?
Right. So one of the things we're very focused on, I would say actually the thing that Center for Education Policy Research is focused on is how do we sort of help districts and states and nonprofits really leverage evidence in terms of sort of making decisions, developing programs, and sort of improving outcomes for kids. And by that we don't mean how do we help them read research papers and look at what the bottom line of the research papers is, but rather how do we help them generate their own evidence and data about what is working and what is not, using the best methods that are feasible. So one major project we have going on now is called the Proving Ground, where we work with a network of districts, and right now we're focused on strategies for reducing chronic absenteeism. And the way that we work with them is we help diagnose what the challenges are in absenteeism and kind of different patterns of absenteeism that are within each of the districts. And then we work with the network to develop a number of interventions to sort of try to improve the outcomes for chronic absenteeism. But here again, we don't just say, okay, great, now let's go do all these things across the whole network. We actually want to test and see whether they work, because it turns out in education and in pharmaceuticals and in most fields, many things you think will work don't. In fact, most things you think will work don't, because things are complicated.
So those don't get published.
Yeah, they often don't get published. But if you look at phase 2 pharmaceutical trials, about 8% fail. There was a recent review of IES-funded evaluations of educational interventions. About 90% failed. So the point is really to identify what works and not assume that what we do works. And so with this Proving Ground group, we develop these interventions, but then we sort of make sure that we try them out in a pilot mode that allows us to tell did kids who got the intervention sort of respond differently than kids who did not, and did their absenteeism go down or not, with sort of a sufficient certainty to be able to say this worked or this didn't. And
it's
if
like
it works,
experimentation out in the field.
It's basically experimentation out in the field, and so we're hoping to sort of create more of a sense of norm of experimenting, and then experiment first, and then take what works and expand it, as opposed to do an intervention across everything, all your schools, and then hope it works. And also, you probably can't tell whether it works because you don't have any control group. So that's one of the key things we're focused on.
And that's an important point, arguably, for policymakers and decision makers to keep in mind. It's oftentimes there are ideas, there's research you might find in a journal or in a paper, but ultimately, when we're talking about kids and we're talking about students, you want to know what's actually going to be most helpful to students, and that might require doing a smaller scale, a pilot, a field experiment before rolling out something across an entire system.
Exactly, and that's where I think we would encourage policymakers to set up these types of structures that sort of encourage people to pilot rather than scale before piloting. so set up innovation funds and sort of or networks that can allow that pay for the smaller scale testing before then paying for the larger scale implementation.
Well, Jon, thank you so much for spending time with us here at the Leadership Institute today. Really appreciate it. As always, it's great to see you.
Thank you. It was great to talk.